Okay, welcome everyone. It is 6:30, so we are going to call to order the meeting of the Cherry Capital Airport Joint Zoning Commission at 6:30. So if everyone could please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, Bob, can you please go through roll call?
Yep. Ms. Clark,
Present.
Ms. Carter,
Present.
Mr. Syke,
Here.
Mr. Winter,
Here.
Ms. Wolf.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Okay, we have, so the agenda is really just this public presentation tonight, but do I have a motion to approve tonight's agenda in front of us?
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Okay, we have motion and second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the agenda is approved. The next item that we have on the agenda is public comment on the agenda item. I will mention that as a part of our presentation tonight, we are going to open it up to public comment. So it's not going to be a typical meeting where you have a specific time to give public comment. This is really meant to be a dialogue between the airport and the community. And so you're welcome to come up and make public comment now, but you're also welcome to kind of engage in the conversation as Bob and Carrie go through the presentation. So any public comment? Yes, come on up.
Maybe for sake of decorum, maybe we can have right here. Have a seat.
Have a seat like
Yep.
facing? Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So, good evening. I have three questions. The first one is that I understand that the zone issue around the airport is really, we have no control over that. The state has said what they've said. But the exemption thresholds in the 10-mile radius, 12 feet around the airport, and then 35 feet right out to 10 miles, is discretionary. It is not dictated by the FAA or the state. So I would like to know if you would consider raising that, at least that 35 feet. My second question is, what triggered the need for the sudden need for this compliance? Because apparently it was like 2001 when the Enabling Act was amended, and so you've known about it since 2001. Was it because you needed some federal grants? I'd like to know what triggered this compliance. And third question is, why weren't these density numbers that are in these zones, zone 1, 2, 3, 4, that are very restrictive in Traverse City and East Bay a little bit, why weren't those numbers included when the future land use of the master plan was passed in 2024? You knew about this, and they're not in there. And it's been 2 years now, and they're still not in there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Any other public comments or questions? Okay, and we will address those questions as a part of the presentation.
Yep.
Okay, that sounds good. So with that, our unfinished business, we've got presentation regarding the Cherry Capital Airport, and I'll turn it over to Bob and Carrie to go through it. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Carrie Zeitz, General Counsel for the Traverse City Airport. I also staff the Joint Zoning Board and the Joint Zoning Commission. And this is Bob Nelson, our airport engineer, who also staffs the Joint Zoning Board and the Joint Zoning Commission. And I want to thank everyone for coming to here tonight. We've been working on this since early 2024. Started off with our discussions with the two counties, Grand Traverse County and Leelanau County, in 2024. So it's great to see all of you here tonight and your interest regarding the joint zoning ordinance and the Joint Zoning Board and Joint Zoning Commission. And I just want to warn everyone before we start that this is a bit of a deep dive into zoning, the Joint Zoning Board, the Joint Zoning Commission, and then the Joint Zoning Ordinance. One of the purposes of tonight, in addition to speaking to the public about this, is to educate the zoning departments from the townships within the 10-mile radius, which we'll be talking about a little more in depth. So that's why this is a really deep dive. There are a lot of slides. I think there are almost 50 slides. So bear with us, and I hope you find this educational, and I hope during our discussion that we answer the questions that were posed in the public comment. So, where are we? Okay, there we go.
Right here.
So, the agenda tonight, introduction, we're going to do a little background, so hopefully we answer the question of why airport zoning, and a little bit of why now. We're going to go through the regulatory context, what is driving the need for airport zoning. We're going to go through how the Joint Zoning Board and Joint Zoning Commission were established. We'll do a review of the draft ordinance. Please note that the ordinance is in draft form. The Joint Zoning Commission has been working on the draft of the ordinance, I think, for maybe about a year now. We've had several meetings working on drafting the ordinance. It's in draft form. We're having this public forum tonight. Next steps after tonight would be a public hearing or more by the Joint Zoning Commission, and then they would recommend a draft ordinance to the Joint Zoning Board, who then will also have a public hearing on that draft zoning ordinance as well before it gets adopted. So then we're going to go through the ordinance and then the permitting process. Bob's going to discuss the permitting process and what this will look like in real life. As indicated by our chair, please, during our presentation, feel free to reach out and ask questions during the presentation. Okay, so just to kind of go back to basics, the timeline for the Cherry Capital Airport. The airport was established in the early 1930s, and it was originally located what was known as Ransom Field. So that was located at what we now know as Veterans Memorial Gardens up there off of Veterans Drive. In 1936, the city of Traverse City acquired some 1,000 acres of property where the airport currently stands, and they moved the airport to its present location. The city of Traverse City did. In 1943, the city of Traverse City leased the airport to the U.S. Navy for their use in connection with the World War II war efforts. An interesting fact about that is that the Navy during that time utilized our Grand Traverse Bay to do what is early drone programs. The Japanese had the kamikaze as one of their weapons of choice during the World War II, and we really didn't have an answer to that because the United States didn't want to send live people in to crash into air carriers and such. So we were working on a drone program that we could send unmanned aircraft to match the kamikaze weaponry of choice by the Japanese. In 1949, the airport was returned by the U.S. Navy to the city of Traverse City, and commercial air service started. In 1971, the city, Grand Traverse County, and Leelanau County created the Northwestern Regional Airport Commission to operate the airport. At that time, the airport, the 1,000 acres, was still owned by the city of Traverse City, but the Northwestern Regional Airport Commission was created by those three entities to operate the airport. In 1990, the city of Traverse City withdrew from the Northwestern Regional Airport Commission and deeded the airport property to Leelanau County and Grand Traverse County. However, the Northwestern Regional Airport Commission continued to operate the airport. In 2020, Grand Traverse County and Leelanau County created the Northwest Regional Airport Authority under the Regional Airport Authority Act. And in 2021, Grand Traverse County and Leelanau County conveyed the airport property to the Northwest Regional Airport Authority. And in 2021, the Northwestern Regional Airport Authority took over both the ownership and operation of the Cherry Capital Airport. That's just a little background on the airport. Oops. So why are we doing airport zoning? Well, from the airport's perspective, current and former sponsors, so we are a sponsor under federal law. We are what is known as an airport sponsor, meaning we operate an airport. We are bound by federal aviation grant assurances. And those grant assurances require us as an airport to take steps to ensure safe navigation of aircraft in and around our airspace, as well as to assure safety of all of those persons on the ground in and around the airport. Additionally, anyone who owned or operated the airport previously, including Grand Traverse County, Leelanau County, and the City of Traverse City, are also bound by those grant assurances to ensure that there is, in perpetuity, safe passage of flights in our airspace. Okay. So we have a couple tools to do that. The first is the Airport Zoning Act, and that was established in 1950. And then we also have the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act, which requires local governments to integrate airport plans into their master plans and zoning ordinances after March 28, 2001. So what that basically means is that we, the airport, we get this airport approach plan from the state of Michigan, and that airport approach plan shows the heights that should be not exceeded around the airport. Bob will talk more about that in depth. The heights that should not be exceeded around the airport for safe flight, as well as the land uses that should be restricted around the airport for safe flight, as well as safety of those around or on the ground, as well as also to ensure compatibility of uses. And local zoning ordinances that have not kept up with the airport approach plan after March 28, 2001, or have created, basically, we'll just leave it at that for now because we're going to get deeper into that. But airport zoning ordinances that have not kept up, it creates gaps. So the gaps, and that creates legal risk for those uses that have been approved since 2001 that might not be in accordance with the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act and the Airport Zoning Act. And so non-compliance could potentially result in an unlawful use, a public nuisance claim, or block development approvals. And we don't want that to happen, so that's why we're doing this now.
Excuse me, sorry, is it okay to interrupt?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Can you go into a little bit more about compatibility of uses? That sounds like an important nuance there that some of us may not understand fully.
Yes, so as we have a whole section on that, but so.
I can wait till then.
Oh, if you don't mind waiting till then, yeah, because I have a whole section on that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Besides,
Yeah.
what certain grant, you said some grant assurances on the previous slide are in perpetuity. Which ones are not?
I don't have the list of which ones are not in perpetuity in front of me. I think there are like 45 grant assurances.
Normally those are like runways, so it'd be useful life, runway lights, that type of thing, it'd be a 20-year span for projects such as that.
So,
FAA in theory could make them pay back every grant that they've ever had. So instead of doing it that, FAA has a 20-year period, so anything that's a useful life. Runway, apron.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jennifer Moore, I'm with the, you know me, okay.
not everybody does. So, Jen, please
My name is
introduce
Jennifer
yourself.
Moore. I work with State of Michigan Office of Aeronautics.
So, but yes, it's the 20-year life, so runway lights, that type of thing. So the FAA only can go back 20 years for projects such as that.
So why airport zoning? Structures and trees that project above the height limitations established by the FAA Part 77, which Bob will talk about in more detail, near an airport are considered hazards to flying and endanger lives and property. They endanger the lives and property of persons on aircraft as well as persons and property of those persons on the ground. I'm sure all of you have seen the news stories in the last, over the course of flying history, but there have been a lot of news stories in the last year or so where aircraft have crashed and landed on the ground, and as a result, people have become injured and property has been destroyed. And so these rules are intended to make everything safe, as safe as absolutely possible. So also some types of uses generally endanger the lives and property because they create hazards to aircraft and or confusion to aircraft, such as radio communication systems that would interfere with the pilot's ability to speak with the air traffic control tower, or would reduce visibility, or would create confusing lights for the pilots, making them think that it's a runway ahead instead of it actually being a runway, or would be hazardous or create hazards to the safe landing of or taking off of aircraft from an airport, such as uses that attract a lot of birds, for like a disposal site, a garbage disposal site that attracts a lot of birds, and that would be a problem for aircraft flying through because of a concept known as a bird strike. It's not good when an aircraft strikes a bird. So additionally, we look at land uses that we want to try to regulate newer expansions of uses near an airport that are just incompatible with such proximity and create safety issues as well as quality of life issues being next to an airport. So the Michigan Airport Zoning Act, I touched on that a bit, that was established in 1950, and it was established to promulgate, adopt, establish, administer, and enforce airport zoning regulations that limit the height of structures and objects of natural growth and otherwise regulate the use of property in the vicinity of publicly owned airports. So under the Airport Zoning Act, there's the Aeronautics Commission that adopts what's known as an Airport Approach Plan or an AAP, and that Airport Approach Plan establishes the heights utilizing Part 77 surfaces, and that Airport Approach Plan also designates what are called land use zones and the basically the rules within those land use zones, which we'll talk about in more detail in just a moment. And then basically that zoning act defines things that are not consistent with the airport approach plan as airport hazards. And the significance about that is an airport hazard under the Airport Zoning Act is what is called a public nuisance. And if you guys are familiar with zoning law, a public nuisance under zoning law can be enjoined or abated or stopped. You can go to court and have that use be taken down or stopped. And then also the Airport Zoning Act defines an airport hazard area, which is, in our case, the 10-mile radius around the airport. So there are two standards in an airport approach plan: land use zoning guidelines, and then the Part 77 height protections. And now Bob will tell us about the Part 77 height protections.
Thank you. All right, can folks hear me okay? I don't have this Okay, fair enough, thank you. So again, just for a little bit of context, what Carrie was just talking about in terms of the state law, that exists today. So regardless of the ordinance and everything else, that is in place today, enforceable today, actually applied to our community today, whether it's known or not, that is in place today. Same thing with FAA Part 77. So this is a federal statute, so Carrie spoke of the state law, this is the federal law that applies. So one of the things that is required if you do construction, and this is where this kind of gets into the 12-foot question, but in terms of notification to the FAA, if you are essentially within about 4 nautical miles of the airport and you're doing construction within an imaginary surface, which I'll get to in a second, you are required to notify and supply a permit to the FAA, and they will in turn tell you whether or not that is a hazard to airport navigation. So that's one piece, and then there are some limitations here. If it's like an automatic presumed hazard, if it's 200 feet or higher, and then we get into some of these other things where there's some in-between gray areas, so to speak, if you will, where we have to make more judgment calls as to what that is, and FAA provides us guidance as to what's a judgment call or not. So again, looking a little bit further at our Part 77, there's a lot of geometry. That's the best way to say it. There's just a lot of geometry. So there's 20-to-1 surfaces, 7-to-1 surfaces. All of these things have a whole bunch of different rules that apply based upon the runway and the airport and the airplanes serving the airport. All of those things are established in a whole bunch of volumes of regulations that we then apply to a given airport to create the surface for each particular airport. So this kind of gives you a better idea, right? If you have planes coming in and taking off, what you're trying to do around that airport is try and make, like Carrie said, make that area as close as possible for those landing and taking off aircraft, safe for arriving and departing aircraft. So what happens is, if you can imagine, so this is that imaginary surface. Think of it like a piece of paper here, right? It's an imaginary surface, and if you have something that protrudes through that surface, like a roof of a building or anything else, those are the things that start to trigger our analysis of whether that's actually a problem or not. So again, as applied to the Cherry Capital Airport, we actually have 2 drawings just because of our particular runways, the east and west runway. So this is the western portion. So if you can imagine, right down here is Garfield, and out here is Long Lake. So you can see there's quite an extensive area covered, again, by the existing federal regulations that apply, and this is just to the west approach. We have some additional for the north-south runway, but that's serves some smaller aircraft, so there are some reduced requirements there. We also have some greater visibility benefit to pilots on the primary runway. That's another reason the surface is a bit larger. And then the same thing to the east. Again, this goes out a fair ways. I think it's past 5 mile out in this direction. So what would that mean if we applied it to our local area? So again, you've kind of got that upside down wedding cake sort of thing. So if you put that on top of the airport and look at topography and you look at the surrounding area, what does that mean? So this purple line outlining the airport here, and again, right on the west side of the Boardman, and then what's actually a ridge, if you will. All of this area in gray, according to the FAA, is if you were to build something 100 feet tall, it would be fine to the FAA. So that means local zoning ordinances would actually kick in well before anything with this ordinance would, or Part 77 would, with respect to this whole area that's grayed out. But when we start looking inside that purple area, we start getting those reduced elevations where we have to start taking closer looks at what height is safe and not. And it's not to say that, again, there's a whole bunch of things. For instance, up in Holiday Hills here, right? East Bay Township has a water tower. It's not to say things can't always necessarily exist there, but it does have a 24/7 red light on it for pilots to know that there's an object there. So there are certain things that can be done on a case-by-case basis to mitigate those sorts of objects. Again, kind of echoing back to what Carrie was talking about with respect to the Zoning Act. So again, the basis is now the Michigan Aeronautics Commission, who Jen works for, are the ones who are defining all the rules at the state law level. And in particular, once again, they're defining what that airport hazard is. And again, it's in conjunction with Part 77. So the other piece that Carrie talked about is those land use zones that came up. And the general intent is that those areas that are close to the runway ends have the most restriction. And as you go further away, there are reduced restrictions applied to those. Again, thinking of safety of pilots as well as folks on the ground. I'll get into this a bit more. But again, this is all defined by the state of Michigan, not the ordinance yet. This is the basis. The state of Michigan has defined all of this. Again, same thing with those land use zones in terms of the restrictiveness, the dimensions, all of the aspects of those land use zones are defined under state law.
Mr. Nelson,
Yep.
why then have we not had this 10 years ago when the airport was starting to really explode and the city was exploding? So why not then?
I cannot speak for why the city did or did not.
Who's driving it now? The airport or?
Who's driving it now?
Driving the.
So once again, I think that gets back to the need, and I think Carrie pointed it out really well, is all of this exists today. All those non-conforming uses are technically illegal. So this ordinance would actually give us a means to adopt variances to get them into legal compliance. That's really the benefit that this does. It'll actually take the control from the state level and bring it back to the local level.
Because if we did nothing, then potentially we're risking our airliners coming and going?
No, I would say if anything, the opposite. You would start getting federal and state involvement in a lot of cases with land development, potential suits, restrictions to city and federal grants. There's a lot of down the line implications of if you're not following the state and federal laws, there's implications to that at the federal and state level.
Grant assurance, the money that the airport receives is.
No, I would say actually the city
is doing this, right?
Actually, the county and city receive. Yeah, I mean, I would say the reasons why the FAA wants us to see something like this in place is those grant assurances. But I would say we think it's the community that wants this in place, so we don't have to have that incompatibility issue. We can come together and have a means by which we can adopt variances to have legal non-conforming uses. In that way, we avoid that whole legal potential there.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'll just add that this has been in practice in the city for probably 2 decades now. So it's in our zoning ordinance, it's in our master plan, in our general provision section. So when we get a land use application, our zoning administrator checks to see if that parcel is in one of those airport approach zones. If it is, he sends it to the airport to begin their process as well. So what this ultimately does is gives us a pathway for allowing projects to continue with variances and mitigation strategies. In the absence of this, we'd have to just stop the project. So I'll give you a quick example on that. Tebow Florist, where the TC Housing Commission built their senior Parkview apartments, that is a density and height in an approach zone that exceeds the limit, but we were able to work with the airport and come up with mitigation strategies to make better quality of life for the residents there, and therefore the project could continue. So this is in practice right now, but this just kind of creates a more transparent, predictable process than we're
The
at.
airport hotel and everything will be low.
Yeah,
It's
and that's
within
outside
Part
of the
77, it
approach
still
zone.
has to follow the same rules. Yep,
Yeah.
That's right in the center of the airport.
yep.
Yeah, and so for instance, the former TC Millworks is a recent property that got approved on Woodmere. They're at the very corner of the approach zone, so when we did our collaborative review process, the airport was there with us and providing their feedback.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard.
And these are kind of the, I'll say, what was in the fine print on this page, but again, this is the page that the state of Michigan issues. This is more of what it says. Again, when you're in those first three zones, zones 1 and 2 and 5, which are those zones closest to the airport, there is that desire to have restricted people density. And then as you get further out, it allows for additional people density as well as low density residential development and specific commercial uses. Again, all of these are within the state law. So the other thing that Jen's colleagues do is something called the Michigan Tall Structures Act. So if you file that notice to the FAA, there is an automatic piggyback built into the system whereby the state of Michigan also reviews that airspace case and looks at things like land use. That said, their primary goals are probably a little bit more state law focused in review of those. So again, dealing more with approaches, obstruction clearance, and things like that. And then it also does what we're here today to talk about, which is defining those measures, what it takes to give that control to the local bodies in order to do things like variances and other things for compatibility with the community. Excuse me. So I won't bore you with all of that. This is, forgive Carrie.
That's okay.
Carrie's,
I'll bore you with it.
Take me up, take me up.
I'll bore you with it.
Can you enlarge it for the visually impaired?
Yeah, we're not going to go through it fully. It's really just to demonstrate that there's this section of the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act that requires the incorporation of the airport approach plan, which we just discussed, into the master plan of the local zoning jurisdiction, as well as a requirement that after 2001, a local zoning jurisdiction cannot make their zoning ordinance more in nonconformity with the airport approach plan than it was in 2001. So basically what that means is that if a local zoning jurisdiction zoned one of our zones, for example, zone 1, which says residential prohibited, single-family zoning, that's fine. Single-family zoning can occur in that zone, even though it's contrary to the airport approach plan. However, if the local zoning jurisdiction upzoned that to high-density residential, for example, that would be a violation of the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act. So that's another big reason why now that we're doing this is to allow, to provide a safety valve or a way out of this conundrum where some zoning ordinances may be inconsistent. And let's go to the next thing. So that I just did a little summary. So we have the Cherry Capital Airport has provided our airport approach plan to our local zoning jurisdiction since 2008. So the legal risks, and that's what we're trying to avoid here, of non-compliance with the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act and the Michigan Airport Zoning Act is that it is legally defined as a public nuisance and an unlawful use. So it could result in unlawful use claims, public nuisance claims, and blocked development approvals. And we're trying to avoid that, and that is one of the reasons why now. So Frenchtown Charter Township versus City of Monroe is a case where the court looked at, Michigan Court of Appeals looked at a request by the casinos to rezone their property from single-family to single-family residential from agricultural. And the township, it's a little bit of a complicated case, but the township denied that request, basically saying that was inconsistent with the airport approach plan. And the casinos filed a claim or a court action against the township saying you can't do that. And the Court of Appeals did confirm that the township had to do that under the Michigan Airport Zoning Act as well as the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act and could not let the casinos rezone their property from agricultural to single-family residential, because that was a violation of the guidance in the land use zones of the airport approach plan. And one of the things that this airport zoning ordinance does, the draft airport zoning ordinance, in addition to protecting aircraft and people on the ground, it would provide a mechanism, in this case for casinos, to rezone their property from agricultural to residential if they were able to acquire a variance, which we'll talk about a little in more detail. So, we already talked about the Tebow Flores case study. So that is one example where since 2001, the density was increased at that particular location in one of the land use zones. And we were very lucky, and we all worked together really, really well to mitigate that situation to allow that Tebow Flores housing development to proceed, because obviously it's a great asset to our community and we wanted for it to proceed. However, the process we used was not as streamlined and transparent as we would like it to be. So what we're looking for is a more streamlined, transparent, codified, supported in the law way to do it. So, the Airport Zoning Act authorizes these airport zoning regulations that will allow us to protect safety, as well as provide this safety valve for these developments that may be contrary to the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act and the Airport Approach Plan. And so what the Airport Zoning Act authorizes is the creation of a joint zoning board, airport zoning regulations, which act as an overlay district basically over the jurisdictions impacted, that regulate the height of structures and trees. They regulate land uses in the land use zones, which I think, I don't know if you guys noticed, I'll bring it back to the map if you want to. The land use zones are very limited area. They really mostly impact the city of Traverse City. I believe there's a little bit in East Bay and a little bit in Garfield, but mostly impact the city of Traverse City. So the land use zones, other than those general land uses that we talked about, like garbage dumps, things like that, they don't impact the other zoning jurisdictions. So there are 3 methods to establish a zoning board under the Michigan Airport Zoning Act, and I will let Bob tell you about the method that we utilized.
Very good. So as we started looking at the development of a joint zoning board that would take on this ordinance, we had to look at the state law that allows these sorts of things to come into fruition. So the state law had 3 different sections, and it's pretty simple in that it's if you're a single county or entity, you can do it on your own, and that's under section 13. If there are 2 jurisdictions or more, you can get into section 14. But then there's this section 17 version, and not only does that involve the counties, but then it also involves the State Office of Aeronautics to kind of help provide guidance, verify things are being done legally, and give perhaps local municipalities that do not have the expertise in aviation law, gives them that person to act and help them in the deliberations at the board. So the 2 counties were presented with this, and they elected to move forward with section 17. And so we did a joint study session. This was, again, going back to 2024. At that point, both counties put in written requests to the Michigan Aeronautics Commission. The Michigan Aeronautics Commission then established what's considered a airport hazard area. So that's that 10 nautical mile radius. So that, again, that's defined by the Michigan Aeronautics Commission. And that's what kind of establishes this whole envelope in baseline. So again, this will be posted online, and there are some links here for you to be able to refer to some of this after the meeting.
Mr. Nelson,
Yep.
maybe this is better for Ms. Jennifer. How is the 10 nautical, how did you come up with 10 nautical miles? I mean, our delta is roughly 5, a little less than 5 actually, 4.4 I
Yep,
believe, right?
it actually goes, it follows the approach plan coming into the airport. The actual approach for the aircraft flying is actually 12 miles out, but we actually reduced it down to 10. Most of the zoning ordinances are at 10 miles, but we do have a couple exceptions. One is Detroit Metro, that is 20 miles out. MBS International is 15, and so is Willow Run.
What's Pellston?
Pellston does not have zoning under this act.
And Grand Rapids was
Grand Rapids is 10,
Flint,
which is also 10.
Saginaw.
MBS, if you're talking MBS, that is 15, but they're all under one zoning, so Bay City, Midlands, Saginaw, and MBS are all under one zoning ordinance.
And do all those airports have this 35-foot height trigger that needs a permit from the airport?
It depends on the length of the runway and what it is, but yes, they all have the same structures, the same process to follow. Anything within a certain distance of an airport has to be looked at. They were talking about with FA&B filed, that starts that process.
Anything large, taller than a regular residential two-story house needs a permit?
Depending on how the proximity to the airport. And then even then, like for the state of Michigan, anything over 200 feet. So anything over 200 feet
There's
has
a lot of difference between 35 feet and 200.
but that's anywhere in the state, not necessarily near an airport.
Yeah.
And
So-
then anything 500 above has a whole separate review that needs to be looked at. So that's when you get into the wind turbine.
And again, think about that entire area in gray that was on the map. All of that is essentially, unless you're putting in like an antenna tower or something more significant, you're trying to propose a wind turbine or something. Again, think of that as applying to that gray area. Essentially, everything else in there is really limited.
You don't have to get a permit in that gray area then, if you're building a
Yeah,
35 feet.
again, it depends on what you're doing, but yeah, you may not need to do that.
That's very different from what I've been hearing for the last few months.
It's
So.
what's in the ordinance, but yeah. Another question?
In regards, does this apply to all publicly owned airports? Or
Public
is it
use
just
airports.
for, what's that?
Public use airports. Not all airports are publicly owned. But yes, public use airports, this all is for every
Okay.
public use airport, even like those small grass strips in St. John. If they're a public use airport, they have these protections.
Or like the one in the southwest or central southern portion of Green Lake Township, which the 10-mile radius just touches Duck Lake Township. Green Lake Township owns an airport.
If you don't have Michigan airport zoning, if you're just under the Zoning Enabling Act, then it's 6.75 miles.
Well, I'm just curious.
Yep.
This is all Greek to me. We have a public owned airport that's been there since 1950s and, build it. Have
Yeah, so
fun.
how's that
Good time.
gonna affect Green Lake then, in the flying airplanes off of Green Lake?
Now, that's all done through FAA, through their flight services, so they actually make sure it's safe. So anytime they do an approach, they confirm and work with the other airports before they set an approach.
What about any private airports?
Private, they don't have the same,
Protections.
they don't have the same
I know they don't have
protections.
the same protections, but is this gonna be able to control what goes on at the private airports?
No. I mean, unless we're talking about heights and anything else in land use, but
Building
other
heights
than,
isn't
yeah.
an issue, but like flying airplanes at pattern altitude is not a problem.
No.
Any other questions? It is the case that, again, Green Lake is in the very extreme corner, so again, you're talking about
But
heights well above what,
Think about the Bay City Center. MBS, Midlands, there's a lot of large airports that piggyback. Then in that case, they decided to share the same coordinates.
Well, I think of like Lowell inside the Charlie, underneath the shelf of the Charlie. It's not in that core area, but it's still within there. But they're not restricted by any of the zoning ordinances for what they're doing as far as flying. and
As far as
operating.
flying,
as
no.
far as flying.
Yeah.
There are FAA procedures for operating
Yes.
in and off that,
Sure.
but yeah, no, they're not
You just
restricted.
can't build a new tower, a 200-foot tower there, or
Exactly.
smaller.
Potentially, depending.
All right, good questions, thank you. Keep going here. So again, this joint zoning board that was established, Again, these are the committee members. So Grand Traverse County got to appoint 3 members. Leelanau County got to appoint 3 members. The Airport Authority has 1 member, and then the Michigan Aeronautics Commission, by virtue of Ms. Moore, is the other person on the Joint Zoning Board. So I didn't do this. This is in the state law. We're going to get confusing. There's joint zoning boards and joint zoning commissions. We'll get through it. So this is the joint zoning board. Think of this as like the parent board for the whole ordinance. So what do? They appoint the joint zoning commission, which we'll get into. Then they also are the ones who will take the ordinance, the draft ordinance proposed by the commission, and take that to a public hearing before putting it into place as an ordinance. They will also, after the ordinance is adopted, create a zoning board of appeals. Again, a function of the joint zoning board. And then on an ongoing basis, that joint zoning board, again, that's kind of like the parent organization that will keep going on in perpetuity. And again, if any amendments come to the ordinance in the future, they would be dealt with through that joint zoning board. Okay, so here's the commission. That's what these fine folks here are here today. And their role, as appointed by the board, was to do what we're talking about, which is draft this ordinance. What are the pieces? How does that interact with each of their local zoning municipalities and laws? And how do we get this all to work together? So that's where we've been working together over the past year to try and help that come together through this ordinance. So what are some of the things that they do? Not only do they recommend that ordinance, but again, what we're doing here today is a and. Eventually there will be another public hearing, but this group in particular wanted to make sure that there was additional avenues, particularly for local zoning and planning folks, in addition to the community, to be able to understand all the inner workings of this ordinance before it got out to a public hearing. And again, once this ordinance is adopted, these fine folks will be sent on their way for future service. So what does this ordinance do? It's supposed to be complementary, right? So it doesn't take away any local zoning. It just acts as another layer and kind of integrates into the existing zoning systems. What are we trying to do? Like we were talking about, it's all about safety. So again, its foundation is in the height requirements of federal law, Part 77. It also has its foundations in land use restrictions under state law that we've been talking about. And so, again, the whole idea is to the point of why haven't we known this since 2001? This is exactly why we're here. Everybody needs to know about this because there is development happening. And to the extent that we can allow safe development to happen, we want to be partners in that. But we also have the flying public and people on the ground to protect as well. So we're at that kind of critical juncture of needing these things to be in place in order to allow variances where possible or safety to govern where needed. Yep.
Does the airport authority itself have any role in approving this ordinance or maintaining?
Nope. Yep. So good question. So the question was, does the airport authority have any role in the ordinance? The only role that they have is the single seat that they have on the board. Again, the majority is the 2 counties and then the state of Michigan. Other than that, the airport authority has no role and no direction over the joint zoning board.
So they don't have to approve it, or it's not?
Nope, there's no approvals by the airport authority. This is essentially its own authority, if you will. It's its own quasi-governmental entity. Yep. Any other questions?
And they're responsible to whom? The state of Michigan?
They're kind of, again, that quasi-governmental entity, but the people who are appointing them are coming from both counties. So you could argue that both Grand Traverse County and Leelanau County are kind of the parents of the joint zoning board.
And what happens when the kids grow up. So they're the parents now. I'm confused. I see Leelanau County, Grand Traverse County, the airport, the authority board have their own people. That dissolves once this is.
No, so the board continues on. So that's why I'm saying it's confusing. Only these fine folks here go away. And this is the commission. So this is the commission. The folks back on the board, these folks are the ones who will continue on through their appointed terms. The joint zoning board was actually the one who took their applications and appointed them to the zoning commission to establish the ordinance. Again, so as soon as that's done, these folks go away, and that board, not the commission, but the board will run the ordinance in perpetuity. And again, they're managed, governed, parented by the two counties. Does that help? Okay.
Mr. Nelson, do we have representation from all the townships within that 10 nautical mile hazard area on the commission?
Not on the commission, no. One of the, they were invited here tonight, so I contacted MTA and each individual township to be here tonight. But in terms of representation, it was the feeling of the board that the primary folks impacted by the ordinance, the city, Garfield Township, East Bay Township, Acme Township, and Peninsula Township, those are really the ones who are most impacted. Again, in those outlying townships, you really have to be talking about something 200 feet tall or higher to really trigger any sort of significant review. So, yep. So just a point in case, I think it was out in Solon Township up in Leelanau, there was like a hotel proposal, and they're like, oh, what about? And it's like, you're so far away and high up, I don't have anything to say about that, because well beyond land use restrictions and well above any heights that I'm concerned about.
Bob, what happens when, as you know, we expect this airport seems to have great ambitions to grow and grow and grow and grow. What's the impact on these kind of ordinances? Do they get stricter?
Nope. So again, this is I'll call it steady as she goes. So we've done the analysis that says the runway ends as we have them today do not need to grow. The aircraft that are serving our airport today can reach Europe or the West Coast. And there's no plans to go to 747s or anything like that, much less a need. So at this point, we kind of have the four corners of the airport. We may need to grow buildings like the terminal to serve passengers, but in terms of the footprint of the airport itself, that is defined. And that stays with this process.
I find that amazing. I imagine what they would have said in 1950, that we've got the big airport we have now, it's never going to grow, and yet look where we are today.
And that's interesting you say that, because if you actually look at the existing property, it's pretty much the same thing. That it really hasn't grown.
But it hasn't grown maybe physically, but it's grown in the impacts on the trees that need to be cut, or restrictions on heights of buildings. Maybe we can't do certain kinds of upzoning, right, in certain areas. So there are impacts. And my kind of question is sort of like, can you speculate on what it might be like in 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 50 years from now?
So I can offer this, is if there ever would be a change, whether any of those sorts of changes, both the FAA and the state of Michigan require public hearings, they require public input, they require environmental documents that catalog potential impacts to the community and stuff like that. So anytime work like that is done, there would be something like this if, I would imagine if there was more impact to the community. Again, because we're living within our existing boundaries, we're not really pushing that. And I understand what you're saying about some of the development stuff, but at the same time, it's been there since 1950. We're needing to have everybody in the community play catch up with what the rules were, because back then it probably wasn't as impactful, right? Where the airport is today was considered way out of town back at that point in time. Now we've got a lot more development, and it's a different story. So that's where again, all those laws and things were in place. Now we're just trying to find ways to make more compatible development that's still safe. Question?
Everything that's currently an existing non-conforming use, will they all be grandfathered in, or is everything going to be
Yes.
looked at particularly with exemptions?
Yep, nope. So that's coming up. Stole some of Carrie's thunder. Yes, that's the benefit of the ordinance. As soon as it gets adopted, everything that's existing today becomes a legal non-conforming use. So if there's ever any change, if you ever want to take your single story on 8th Street again and make it into a 200-foot tall tower, we've got a change in zoning, we've got a change in height, we've got lots of changes, that's a different story. But again, continued use in its existing form, that's the intent of the ordinance, is to allow those existing uses to continue.
So I guess instead of kind of beating around the bush, I'll kind of approach it. When we talk about uses of buildings that use, but a tree is a use as well. So in particular, Oakwood Cemetery, which is kind of a contentious point, that would be a existing use.
Indeed.
It would be non-conforming but legal.
It would become, that is one of the benefits. It becomes a legal, non-conforming use. Yep. Yep. Okay, keep going. Okay, again, what we're talking about is what's being put into and what's being governed. Again, we're taking those federal and state laws and adapting and putting them into our local regulations. Again, height restrictions, again, based upon the airport elevation, land use regulations based upon state aeronautics code, and then flight standards. Again, so actually this very thing right here, this, I mean, if you point this at an aircraft, you will go to jail. So don't do that. Those are the sorts of things. So, and we've got a couple other examples in here. I've got, for instance, a billboard that I'm in conversation with Lamar about. How can we do things to allow them to display their advertising but not have flashing lights pointing at pilots? Those are the sorts of things that we want to do. So we're not saying no more billboards, we're just saying make sure it doesn't distract the pilot who's on final so there's not a crash. Talked about Part 77. We can get into a few more things. I guess one of the things to think about too, when we get into the permitting aspect, just because you have to permit something doesn't mean it's a problem. It only means we want to know about it. So you can permit something and it's totally fine, we won't have to do anything special. But then if it's close enough to the airport, there are those cases where you may not be thinking about something that we think about more often, with respect to safety or height or lights or other things. So those are the things that we want to be able to see and have a bit more visibility into, and that's what this helps with. I think we've talked about this quite a bit at length. I think Carrie had referred to it earlier too. Another good example is GFL on Hammond, right? That's not a big open disposal dump. That's actually required to be a covered dump, and that's one of the reasons why is the proximity to the airport. So another thing to think about you may not have thought about before.
So with the wildlife attractants, if you're going from, you're saying some trees are a hazard because of the height, but would the airport really prefer to have like a prairie or open grassland rather than trees? Because it seems like the forested areas, you don't really get birds, much bigger than, woodpeckers and maybe some owls, but on an open field, you're going to attract geese, sandhill cranes, herons.
So, and that's why we actually have this gentleman right here with a very specific wildlife mitigation program on the airport. So we manage our grass to reduce, wildlife attractants, including goose and duck. We're actually required to go out there and make sure that those sorts of waterfowl and stuff aren't sticking around. Again, you've heard of Miracle on the Hudson. We don't want a miracle on the bay here. So those are the sorts of things we are actively doing. We can essentially scare those birds away. And oddly enough, you'd be very interested to know in the amount of wildlife in terms of birds, I mean, we have everything from bald eagles, snowy owls, all the way to sandhill cranes. We have to deal with foxes and skunk and all sorts of things. All of those things are the things that we need to be cognizant of to keep away from aircraft.
Well, I imagine that's what I'm wondering, like you're from the approaches on private property, not on the airport, where they don't have like, dogs to chase them off or anything.
Mhm.
Wouldn't you rather, in a forested area like ours, maintain the forest, with the height of the trees being less of a problem than having open fields that attract large migratory birds?
To the extent aircraft don't run into them, yes. I mean, right, I mean, that's all what we're talking about. We need trees to be away from landing planes, because that's not safe.
Well, yeah, and you also don't want to have landing birds. So it looks like if you remove the trees, you're going to increase the big birds.
Not necessarily
Because
true.
You're going to be going from a forest that only has some small birds to an open field like a golf course or something that's an extraordinary attractant to geese and herons and sandhill cranes and things that could really damage.
And again, that's why we actively mitigate that. But again, when we need to have safety for airplanes, and then we do activities to make sure those birds don't come.
But not off the airport.
Correct, yeah, not off the airport, yeah.
Right, so you might be telling the property owner to cut down their trees, and you create a worse problem than attracting birds.
Again, we're only talking about trees where there's a problem with an aircraft and safety.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're not going out far and abroad. Again, if you go back to those height limitations, again, think about where even that 100-foot was. I mean, we're always in close proximity to the airport, so we're not talking about going and creating wide swaths of tree removals.
In the approaches.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like,
But an aircraft's gonna hit a tree. I mean,
well, if you have a 100-foot tree, all the planes are, at least 100 feet above that.
until you get closer to the runway and it's 50-to-1 slope on their runway. So it's for every 50 foot out, you go up 1 foot. It's a very gradual slope, and the planes are going 200 plus miles an hour, if not more than that. And they have split-second decisions to make sure they're not going to clip the tree. Plus, there's airport inspectors that go out and actually look to see if these trees are there. If they are, the airport can technically lose their license by not having those areas.
Even if you're creating a worse problem for birds.
That their first their FAA's first look is to make sure there's no obstructions. Secondary
Did I hear correctly then that the trees in Oakwood, the current height is going to, when this is passed, is going to be measured, and then anything above that can be topped?
No, I'm saying that what's there today will be considered a legal non-conforming use.
What's there today, no matter how high it gets?
I mean, I would say not no matter how high it gets. I would say it's been pretty high. It's pretty much an established canopy at this point. Again, at some point, if there would be such a thing as a 100-foot tall tree on the center line of approach, that would have to be dealt with. That's not what's there.
That's not happening.
That's not what's there, though. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'd like to point out there was a map that went around, I think was created from the city, about trees that need to be removed. And there was a ton of trees that need to be removed, and I understand that that had nothing to do with the airport, Oakwood Cemetery.
Okay. What is that about? I mean, we've certainly been talking to the city about what's the longevity of the cemetery. The trees don't live forever. So what does that mean for the future? Is there an opportunity to create a beautification project there? So those are the sorts of things, and that might be tied to some of that future planning. Yeah.
I have something to add to that. As a neighbor in the same neighborhood, I think it was actually a plan that was FOIA requested and it came from the FAA. I think it was an FAA document. Earlier or later after that, in the Record Eagle, Kevin Klein was quoted as saying, "We have no plans to top or remove any trees in Oakwood Cemetery."
Yeah.
For the good of the people here, the reading of that is quite interesting. I think the document came from the FAA. Kevin Klein says, "We have no plans as the NRAA, as Chair Capital Airport.
Correct.
Do not have any plans to remove any trees."
Right.
That's not being lost on all of us.
Okay.
That's a very strict parsing of words that isn't lost on all of us.
So again, by us getting into this ordinance, that gives us the buffer with FAA to say they're now a legal, non-conforming use. Right now, you don't have that leg to stand on. If FAA would show up tomorrow, so again, these are the things that we're actually trying to do to help benefit the community.
So we can continue on this topic, which is important to a lot of us. I would like to hear from somebody who has a good understanding of city ordinances and city harbor plans and how these intersect with the zoning overlay that's proposed.
I don't know if we're ready to present on that particular question tonight, but I will defer to Sean to see if he has anything to say.
Yeah, what's the specific question?
Are there any arborist plans within the city that address this particular zoning ordinance?
Not to my knowledge. I know that the arborist does periodically cut down trees just because they're at the end of their useful life or they're diseased or something like that. But to my knowledge, there's no overall plan of removing trees in any portion of the city by the city of their own trees.
And would there be input and collaboration and coordination if this were to go through as a zoning overlay? Would the arborist be then heavily involved in all these processes?
Yeah, I mean, the city as a whole would be, and the arborist.
We'd want to, in those cases where it came into play, we'd want to do that. Again, we've got a lot of places that are something we want to know about, but again, can be considered legal non-conforming uses, so they don't become the problem that they are today, technically. Yep.
So I have a question for Zone 2 uses. So just west of Garfield there's a high-density residential zone area and future land use area that's a mobile home park. And so in Zone 2, that'll be a non-conforming allowable use. But my question is, it'll be, I think, a Class 1 non-conforming use, and it says in there that those structures can't be substantially changed, repaired, or altered. So my concern is that mobile homes, by their nature, are not forever. So what happens to those residents when their structures at the end of its useful life?
Yep. So to the extent that that entire parcel remains a trailer park, again, that's an existing use. So if that entity would sell carte blanche that entire unit of however many units are within it, and then the new landowner wanted to change the use, that's what would trigger. Not if somebody, if somebody brings in a new unit, that is not being triggered under this ordinance. Yep.
But I believe they would not be allowed to expand that trailer park's footprint under that status, correct?
At least not within that land use zone. Yeah, that's correct.
But according to the zone map, Zone 2 only allows up to 5 people per acre. So anything, you couldn't actually come in and build a multi-family building in there. You could
Correct.
basically put one family home.
Well, again, if you stuck with the existing trailer park as it is, that's probably the best and highest use you could manage with that parcel.
But if the trailer park goes away, then you're really restricted to one residence.
Yeah, I mean, you would be essentially restricted to an equivalent density.
Yeah, you would be restricted without a variance. So we'll talk about the variance process next, but or as we get further. But if you got a variance, which the zoning ordinance accounts for a variance, and the variance process under the zoning ordinance is less strict and less rigid than the typical zoning variance process that you see in the city or in the townships. It's more flexible, and it's really looking towards allowing the use as long as it's not unsafe with mitigation measures, which is basically kind of the model that we used for the T-Bow florist, allowing that. We allowed that because it was safe, and we implemented some mitigation measures such as letting the residents know they're within the proximity of the airport, putting in some soundproofing into the building, those kind of things. So it's not that it would technically be not allowed, but it could be allowed with a variance, which is a much more flexible process than regular zoning variances.
And to clarify one more time, because I really have heard many different, well, I've heard different opinions on this, and from you in particular, that the variances are really only necessary within these zones. And I don't know what zone 5 is, because I've never seen that, but the zones around the airport. Outside of that, unless you're building something that's 100 feet or has flashing lights on it, you do not need a permit, you need nothing, right?
Correct, yeah. Outside of the land use zones, you're just looking at height and those like broad land use categories like garbage dumps, things like that. So unless it's higher than the height limit, no variance would be needed.
But the height limit is,
Do you want to?
Height limit, yeah, so I was just gonna say, here's how we're kind of thinking about this permitting process, and this may help answer some of those questions. So again, right now, as established by the ordinance, this area in blue, as well as this area in red, would constitute what's considered a mandatory permit. Again, just because you have a permit doesn't mean you have a problem. It just says we want to know about it. So those are the areas, but then we start looking at these land use zones. If you have an existing land use and you're changing it, those are the sorts of things that we'll want to know about. Existing uses would remain as legal non-conforming uses in each of these land use zones. If you tell me you want to put up a wind turbine out in the approach, those are the sorts of things that I'm starting to be concerned about for the flying public and everyone on the ground for that matter. So a couple things to think about, and I think this gets to some of your questions about where do some of these heights and stuff come from. So again, going back to the FAA, so the existing federal law, anytime you construct something within roughly 4+ nautical miles of the airport, you must automatically submit, even though people aren't doing it, you should be submitting to the FAA a permit request to see if you have an aviation hazard. And so what this permitting surface does is mirror that out to 35 feet. So this blue limit is exactly that, because these fine folks, as we were developing the ordinance, were like, well, you have to go through a special permit process anyway for anything over 35 feet. So it's the easiest way to differentiate those areas is the magical 35 foot, because it's a 35 foot magical height within their ordinances, so it makes a lot of sense to mirror that in this ordinance.
Can I make one clarification?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in looking at our ordinances, one thing that we found was that our, thank you. We were looking at our ordinances, oftentimes 35 feet is the trigger for what we allow with, like in East Bay Township, for example, we allow a maximum height of 35 feet in our low density, our moderate density, basically all of our like residential districts that are mixed housing or single family detached housing. We found it was similar in Garfield Township and Acme Township. I can't remember what Traverse City is.
Yeah, most of our neighborhood residential is at 35 feet too.
Yeah, so that felt like that was a reasonable one where we could reduce the number of permits that would be required if we were keeping, I think it was maybe originally presented at like 30 feet. So we said if we could do 35 feet, then that would reduce the number of permits that would be required.
so outside that blue zone, I can build, if I'm in a commercial zone and the zoning says I can go to 45 feet, I can do that without having to talk to the airport.
Without having to talk to the joint zoning board, yes.
Yeah. And our intent there was, for individual property owners not to have a burdensome process that they need to add an addition to their house or something like that. And working with the airport staff, that was a sufficient height limit for their safety concerns to draw the line at.
And again, we're actually trying to, I don't want to see everything that's going on either. So that's why we also have additional exemptions within this permitting area. So for instance, if it's, it's one thing if you're trying to build a gas station right next to the airport, it's another thing if it's residential use. So that's the non-hazardous use clause. So another exemption, and these are all in it, and statements, not or statements. So all of these have to be true to get an exemption. So a non-hazardous use is outside of one of the land use zones. So think of a lot of these areas off to the northwest, north of the airport, the southeast, and even a little bit over here to the southwest. all of those areas are outside those land use zones. That's another thing that if you're in that area, you have a non-hazardous use and you're less than 12 feet in height. So we don't need to care about fences, dog houses, whatever else is going on. In all those areas, we don't need to worry about those particular developments. Those will be exempt from that permitting process.
Solar panels, they're usually less than 12 feet.
Yeah. So it is also the case that I would say at a commercial level, all the people doing commercial level, private is a
off-grid kind of cabin stuff.
Private is not an issue. The FAA takes issue with large-scale solar in the instance whereby glare from the solar panels would provide a distraction to the pilot. On the plus side, most of the glazings provided to those now are constructed in such a way it's a non-issue. So that problem is going away. Yes, Mr. Ferguson.
So Bob, question that maybe it'll help. So if I'm the person that has, like the trailer park we talked about, if this new zoning board does not go into place, we go with the state, and I need a variance, what are my options? That we're explaining, we explained what the variance would be now. It's a local board, local people that we talk to. If this doesn't get set up and I need a variance, where do I go?
There is no variance.
There you go.
So under state law, you would just be considered an illegal use. Yep. And that's where we're at in a lot of places. So,
Good question.
back first.
We hear a lot about drones. Are drones going to...
Drones are regulated by the FAA as well. Yep. So there's actually some state legislation going around too, but yes, drones are actually regulated by the FAA. If you are a commercial drone operator, for anybody who likes to do things on the side, you are supposed to be an FAA certified drone pilot. If you are not, you are breaking the law. You can go to jail. So if you're just doing it on your own, again, we like to avoid having people fly near airports. And to that point, a lot of the cards so like the GPS coordinates, drones actually understand where they are on maps. It's actually baked into their chips to avoid going close to airports. Only the commercial operators can apply to the FAA to get special zones taken out of their chip for a limited amount of time with approval from the air traffic control tower. So that I would say is one benefit, is that there should be theoretically less drone usage around an airport.
Yeah, so we have 2 FAA licensed drone pilots on staff at the city, and the city's drone, it has that chip in it. So there's geofencing. Like for instance, our GIS guy wanted to take an aerial shot of Garfield when they repaved it. And if you look at where that approach zone is, the closest he could be was in Bryant Park to try to get an angle of it, because it won't let the drone go anywhere near those approach zones. Also, like the water treatment plant, the wastewater treatment plant, those are all geofenced. Drones can't go near them and stuff like that. So, and that's all regulated by the FAA, correct?
Correct. Yep. And then, Miss, you have a question?
I have just very basic questions.
Sure.
I just want to know if you plant a tree that's expected to get over 35 feet in that area, then that would require a permit.
In terms of planting trees, I would say that this is where it gets to that point where if it goes beyond that level and it's an aviation safety hazard, that's where we're gonna have to work with zoning folks to think through that. Again, for the most part, there's plenty of trees that are more than 35 feet over in the East Street neighborhood, all that. So again, there are places, mostly again in those approaches, where we're going to be looking at the heights of trees.
So the approaches are, I guess I'm not really...
So yeah, sorry. So we have an east-west runway, so that's where you're seeing it kind of elongated this way.
And the cemetery is just north.
Yep, and so the cemetery is right here. Yep.
Oh, right here.
Yep. So we've got the this north-south
we're
orientation
over
as
to the
well.
right,
Yep.
north of the runways.
So again, over in here, again, there's a bunch of trees that are there today that are not aviation hazards yet.
Okay.
Again, we would be thinking about more fixed structures. So
I know that's a big concern in the neighborhood.
Okay,
And
no,
and
that's,
just to add, the way that the ordinance is currently drafted, you would not need to get a permit for that. You only need to get a permit if the thing that you want to put in is greater than the allowed height. So if the thing you want, the tree is 5 feet and the allowed height is 35 feet, even though the tree may grow above 35 feet, you would not need a permit for that.
any other questions? Yeah,
Quick question.
yes, sir.
The questions just keep coming. So, if weather conditions change to an extent that runway uses change and airplane sizes change, how does that affect the imaginary spaces that are the basis of the zoning, the sort of the slanted paper that you described? When you change weather condition, change the size of planes, so we live in the Oakwood neighborhood and see once in a while wind pattern changes, larger planes start flying over us. Are you going to go based on like a minimum thresholds, and if we can put a plane at that size over that area, so we'll take the heights down to the minimum? Is that
So again, what's established today is going to stay put. We would have to go through a whole process with both the FAA and the state to justify lowering anything on any runway, on much less the north-south. So that presumes a whole nother process that is, again, we're just talking about maintaining what we have today. Any changes is a whole separate process. Yep. Does that answer your question?
somewhat?
In the process he's talking about with the state and FAA, it actually requires wind analysis, aircraft analysis. It's a couple-year project, actually, it takes, and then they look at a 20-year horizon.
So, but those shifts in sort of traffic patterns over our heads, they're all, of course, regulated, so a plane of a certain size and certain wind conditions couldn't land.
So I can help with that, I think. So again, a lot of the larger aircraft, there's something called a crosswind component. So larger aircraft can deal with stronger crosswinds than smaller airplanes. So that's why if you get a stronger north wind, you'll continue to see commercial air traffic continue to use the east-west runway, but you'll start to see other aircraft, the college, that sort of stuff, use the north-south runway. Yep. So does that help answer that? So, I mean, I will say we've had times where there have been 60-mile-an-hour winds out of the north, and you'll see some of the regional jets evaluate that north-south runway, but even at that, these days they much prefer the length associated with the main east-west runway, just because of the ability to stop if they need to.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. Trying to see if there are other things on here. Am I off to you, Ms. Carey?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Okay, so we've talked about this a lot already, but under the zoning ordinance, all non-conforming uses would be preserved. So these are existing structures, trees, or land uses that would not currently meet the ordinance requirements, but they would be allowed to continue. So this is one of the main drivers of this, is we want to make sure that all the uses, the heights, et cetera, that are already in place, that we have a moment in time where they're all lawful and legal, and we can move forward, and we're addressing that legal gap or that legal risk. Of course, expansions or significant alterations of any of the non-conforming uses typically require obtaining a permit, an exception, or a variance. So, as we discussed, a non-conforming use, just because it becomes a now no longer legal non-conforming use, doesn't mean it has to go away. It might need to go and get a variance to allow it to continue with mitigation measures. So the way we do these mitigation measures and allow uses that are no longer legal non-conforming uses to continue if they expand or enlarge, or allow uses that are not allowed under the zoning ordinances, or heights not allowed under the zoning ordinances through this variance process. And the variance process is outlined in the Michigan Airport Zoning Act at 259454. And there's also a case called Pegasus Wind versus Tuscola County. And that case basically established that we could establish more flexible variance standards than is typical in your city or your township zoning ordinances. And so the standards that we have in our zoning ordinance currently are these more flexible standards. In particular, these flexible standards would allow variances where we can mitigate the issue. So we can mitigate the safety issue if it's too high by putting a light on it, if we can mitigate the issue that way, or a land use issue like TiVo. You know, one of the issues with respect to uses close to the airport is we don't want these incompatible land uses, so we can mitigate that by requiring them to install thicker windows or more insulation for sound to alleviate the sound from being close to an airport, or letting their residents know they're in the proximity of an airport, so they know and they have that knowledge that they're moving next to an airport, just so to prevent any issues in the future. So one of the standards, they're very flexible standards. Economic hardship alone is not sufficient grounds to obtain a variance under the ordinance, which is very common and typical in your regular zoning ordinances. And the variances must align with ordinance goals and can't compromise public safety or airport operations. And then the mitigation conditions I just spoke about. Yes?
I assume it's a separate zoning board of appeals?
It is. It's a separate zoning board of appeals.
Is that been appointed yet, or is that a?
It has not. It will not be appointed until after the zoning ordinance is adopted. And then it will be appointed by the joint zoning board.
There'll be a separate zoning board other than townships and city and so on.
Yep. And the administration and enforcement of the ordinance will be done by the zoning administrator. It's currently drafted as the airport engineer will be the zoning administrator. And there are fines and civil action process as in any other zoning ordinance. However, just like any other zoning ordinance is enforced, they're typically enforced on a complaint-based basis. And the goal always is to work with the landowner to try to resolve the issue before you go to fines or court action. But you know, any good ordinance has to have an enforcement mechanism. So, any questions on that?
Maybe one.
Sure.
How would the variance be granted for a tree? Can it continue to grow?
Yes, a variance could be granted for a tree by requiring a light on it, or what other mechanisms would you?
Again, it all depends on that safety criteria. If it exceeds the safety criteria, we have to find ways to mitigate it. We can trim it, we might have to do other things. I mean, again, the worst case scenario is to cut it, but the whole idea with enacting this ordinance is to get people thinking about, hey, I'm not going to plant a 60-foot tree here because everything else around it is only 45 feet tall, and we don't want to see anything higher than what exists today. So again, at the point where something sticks up and becomes an aviation hazard, that's the point where we're going to be looking at the enforcement side of things. So hopefully we can work with you that, hey, this is growing tall, or this has the possibility to grow tall. Maybe we trim or top it early in its life so it does to grow wider than taller. I do. And we've done that for decades with airports around the state. Does that answer your question?
Partly. Enough for now.
Fair enough.
Yes.
I see in here, talking about zoning board of appeals, there's something called a non-conforming use certificate. I guess I was thinking originally that any non-conforming use is sort of grandfathered in. So I see this section on non-conforming use certificate, don't exactly understand. Can you clarify, like, who would need to get that and at what point?
Yes, there is no need to get a non-conforming use certificate, just like there's no need to get a non-conforming use certificate under general zoning ordinances. But it is always a good idea to get a non-conforming use certificate, because that lets the zoning jurisdiction know, hey, I've got this use out there that's non-conforming. I want to make sure that you know I have this use. It's a legal use. Once we know you have the use, it's a legal use, then no problem, can continue on. And especially like, that would be, I think, important with trees. If you have a tree that's too high, to get a non-conforming use certificate. So we know, hey, that tree has always been there and it's always been there at that height.
So where is this zoning ordinance? Because the only ordinance, the only act that I see on the TVC website is the State of Michigan Airport Zoning Act here at Capitol Airport from 2001, which shows all those zones that you talked about.
It is under, so we have a page, if you pull down the, I'm sorry, the thing is really slow, but it's under information, and it says CCA joint, or CCA zoning, and if you click on that page, there is the.
I see the draft ordinance.
Please review the draft ordinance.
All right, thank you.
That's where it's located. Yeah, and we encourage everyone to review it and understand it and provide us with your suggestions when we have a public hearing on it, and give us your feedback and thoughts. And obviously, you can give us your feedback and thoughts before the public hearing. You can email Bob.
Well, it's actually, we've created a dedicated zoning email, so that's listed on that same page where the ordinance is.
When is your public hearing planned?
We have not set the public hearing yet. We wanted to have this public forum for everyone, and then the Joint Zoning Commission next meeting is March, a regular meeting, March 18th.
Yeah.
And at that meeting, we will look towards whether we're going to set the public hearing at that point, and if so, what will the date be?
So it might be April, May.
Yeah, probably with spring break and everything. It'll be April or May. Okay.
All right, we're in the home stretch. We're getting there. All right, so again, what we're going to be doing in terms of interfacing with our local planning colleagues, we're going to try and develop some integrations with their existing systems. So for some of them, it's Epic GT, BSNA for the city, and then any outlying folks who have other systems will again try and work to get into those processes to make it as seamless as possible. So the planning departments are going to essentially, when these things that are triggered by the ordinance pop up, they'll get in contact with the Joint Zoning Board and myself, and we'll look at those particular permit instances that are triggered. On the plus side, and again, what you're hearing today is by having these ordinances and things out there, people will know ahead of time so there aren't any gotchas along the way. So all of this stuff will be out there. And again, we'll probably have continued dialogue with the community about questions moving forward. So again, the hope, the plan is a process like this. So someone contacts the township or the city to get a land use permit, just like they would in any other development scenario. That official would then determine, one, is it within that 10-mile radius? Again, think of some of those outlying townships. And then if yes, it goes into that mandatory or non-mandatory permit sequence. And then that determines whether or not it needs to get submitted to the airport zoning administrator. So what happens if the answer is yes? Well, then that individual, like you're supposed to do today under federal law, will walk you through the process of submitting that FAA airspace case, which is free. And then, like I kind of mentioned before, the existing system is already built such that when you submit that case, there's an automatic trigger that helps the state evaluate it. Instead of the state just saying no if there's a problem in that land use zone, the state will actually come back to this joint zoning board and to myself to help us evaluate whether or not there's any sort of issues. That being said, if the FAA tells me it's an airport hazard, if it's a hazard to navigation, that tells me kind of what I need to know in those certain circumstances. But any other circumstance, we can work through instances where we might be able to light or trim or do other things to help mitigate that particular development. One thing to note in this, I've been working with a bunch of local contractors on this. So you still have to submit for cranes. So just because you have a structure that's only, say, 20 feet tall, if you need a crane that's 60 feet tall to construct the 20 feet tall, you must submit for the crane because it's, again, operating in that higher space. Now that only requires a submission to the FAA and not to the state. So that would be kind of separate from this particular ordinance here. So if we're good with state and federal requirements, we proceed on in the process. That being said, if there is some sort of denial or non-conforming element to the ordinance that can't be worked through, then that would go to that joint zoning board of appeals. And again, it'll be up to that zoning board of appeals to evaluate the merits of the case versus safety and figure out if there's any sort of incompatibility or compatibility that can be managed from that particular application. Again, a little bit of a, for those of you who may think a little bit differently, it's perhaps easier with the flow chart. Again, application, so is it conforming, yes or no? If it is, we get into this whole local processes, if it is or isn't within that 10-mile radius. Again, this whole review scenario, and again, like I was speaking about before, if it's compliant, it just goes straight through to a building permit. If it's not, then that's where we get into those tangents involving the zoning board of appeals review. So again, just to reiterate, this is our final slide for all of you. Again, here's the reference to where the zoning ordinance is located. It comes with a bunch of maps, some of the things that we've displayed here today. By all means, please look at that, evaluate that, email us with questions. Again, we're trying to use this venue here today and your questions to help these folks further refine the ordinance on a go-forward basis before they consider that public hearing or any further steps.
Mr. Nelson?
Yep.
Are there large-scale maps with the different zones available to view in person? Because the ones that are on the website, buried in all the papers, is very hard to navigate through on the webpage. Open it up even on a big map. I'm wondering if there's anything we've done there.
Yeah, I can say if there's specific questions, I would offer two things because it is digital. You can zoom in and use like a PDF reader to zoom in. I would think, if anything, if you came by the office, that's what I would probably do at the office is the same thing you can do at home is just zoom in on that PDF on your laptop or PC.
I was playing it, I had a hard time.
A suggestion, print off an e-sized copy and put it at the library.
We could do that.
That's a good suggestion.
We could do that. Yeah.
Good sense.
Will this presentation be on the airport website?
Yes. Yep. Any other questions? I forgot.
Yeah, one more. How much is that zoning permit going to cost?
That has yet to be developed.
Who and how are you going to review and manage? Whose responsibility is it to manage those applications? And is that will require different staff people? I mean, you can't do that all, can you?
Exactly. No, yes. There will be supplemental staff to help with reviewing this.
And that'll be an airport expense or a taxpayer's expense?
It will be,
Position?
the intent would probably for it to be some sort of hybrid airport position. Again, there will be some fees associated that could help defer some of those costs, but in general, like I don't have any attribution, so to speak, to the joint zoning board. So, until we get there, I don't exactly know how much between the joint zoning board and the authority and what sort of decisions will be made. That's beyond my purview about how that will be financed.
Nor do you know how many applications you're going to have to review. Yeah, really.
Yeah, no, I think we can get probably a sense from our zoning colleagues what that looks like based upon their annual throughput. But yeah, I can't say I know right now what that is.
I have a just curious question. It says land use, does this cover lighting? I remember when the city of Traverse City and Costco had a little discussion about their lighting before the airport authority started.
Yep.
Do you cover lighting too then for these land use permits?
Yes and no. I would say the baseline is whatever is required by the city or the townships is the baseline. So that doesn't change.
Even though Traverse City doesn't have authority over the lighting at the airport anymore?
But that's a whole, right? So this ordinance, this body considers all property outside of the airport. The airport itself governs its own zoning. So that's where the differentiation, this is all outside of airport property. Does that answer your question?
I think it does.
Okay.
Any airport property you make the decisions on, and the townships or the city, anything out of airport property that's not in the flight zones, are in the flight zones, not in the flight zones?
So the only time we would object to lighting is if you put up one of these big flashing signs that was in the middle of the approach to the runway. I have a feeling the city's ordinance wouldn't let you get there anyway, but yeah, that would be something that we would then come in and take a look at.
Just curious, because it just says land, so I didn't know if that included lighting too.
Again, the baseline is all covered by the existing township and city ordinances, so that's the baseline. It's only in the case where somehow it got through those zoning ordinances, it became a hazard to aviation, where we step in.
Just a couple comments, suggestions. Go slow. Go a lot slower than you want to go. There are about 50 people here tonight, and most of what I heard tonight is news to me. Listen seriously to comments, suggestions, and criticisms of what you got in the draft ordinance, and consider seriously whether it could be changed or moderated. Be completely transparent in what you do more than you think you should have to do for publicity about this, and be transparent. Make everything available on your website, put copies of things like large maps and all of these materials at the library. Really give people that want to try to learn something about this a chance to do so, and then listen seriously to the questions and concerns they have.
You should be the ones recording this meeting, not me.
It's being recorded. Maybe not in the format that you prefer, but it's being recorded.
Are you going to post it?
That goes back to policies, so.
So no.
One more comment, just constructive comment. I appreciate the gentleman's constructive approach to this. I was not very satisfied, as someone was concerned over the tree canopy in a designated tree city, USA, with the answer that we heard earlier about coordination and understanding with the city arborists and ordinances that exist around our tree canopy, which is part of our overarching quality of life. You mentioned quality of life in one slide. It's just 3 words, but it's practically the most important 3 words in this whole room. So I urge you to consider quality of life at every step of the way. not just development, growth, public safety, safety of planes, passengers, people on the ground, but quality of life overall for Traverse City. If we degrade this over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years, we will not be sitting in a place where we desire to live, or children or grandchildren desire to come back to, and we will have done ourselves a disservice, and we will have been part of that. So I urge you to take consideration from the expertise that you have in city, county staff, townships, and put it all to good use here, and make those adaptations that are probably going to be required of this initial draft.
Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we will just wrap up our meeting real quick. So, no new business. Any other public comments, questions? Okay. Member comments? We'll adjourn.